Hi, everybody. Tony Marcolini. Welcome to the podcast. It may interest you to know. I'm joined today with my fabulous co-host, Seamus McDonough, and a journalist and historian and author, Harlow Giles Unger. Welcome, Harlow.
Thank you very much. It's nice to be with you again.
And we wanted to have you back, because you've written so many books, let's face it. You can go to your webpage and see there's got to be at least a dozen. Am I wrong? I mean, you've written a lot of books.
28.
20, yeah, more than more than a dozen. And you're very well known, of course, historian. And your books are impeccably researched. They're just a quality read. I've read many of them and truly enjoyed them.
You're very kind. Thank you.
And I wanted to focus a little bit, particularly on two books that you have. One is about Thomas Paine and the other about Patrick Henry. And the reason for that is because I think they both link so much to society today. And I just thought I'd like to talk about that a little bit. Can you talk about your Thomas Paine book and kind of give the listeners and the viewers a feel for that?
Yeah, Thomas Paine, actually, like Patrick Henry, like Benjamin Franklin, like George Washington himself, was a self-educated person, and brilliantly so. He became truly one of the great writers and polemicists of his generation. His first great work in what became the United States was called Common Sense, in which he wrote that it was ludicrous for an island 3,000 miles away to have the right to govern a continent that is bigger than the ocean that separated England from America. It was ludicrous for one man who wasn't even born in this country to have absolute rulership over, at the time, 3 million people whom he didn't even know, had no contact with. So he made it, the term of his work, common sense, it was simply common sense for the Americans to govern themselves. And this lit a flame under many, many Americans. And it came just after Patrick Henry in Virginia, who was a simple farmer. He was a farmer and a very happy-go-lucky type of fellow. He was a country fiddler, and he entertained. His father ran a tavern at a crossroads. There were no towns in the South. There were a few port cities, but there were no towns. One plantation, the road out of one plantation just led to the entrance of the road into the next plantation. And if there were a few properties with several roads that happened to connect, they would call it something corners, and somebody would build a tavern there, or most likely they would build a church, and so that would be the meeting place. It wasn't they weren't really towns, and at one of these corners there was a church first, and Patrick Henry's father built a small tavern to give worshipers who were thirsty something to satisfy their thirst after long, sometimes all-day sermons in church. And young Patrick was a lively little kid, and like most kids in the country, in the really deep country, like even today, they learn to play the fiddle. It's an relatively easy instrument for them to learn, especially since you can get all sizes. And you have country fiddle contests throughout the Ozarks today, out west in the Rocky Mountains, in the small towns, cattle towns. Loads of people play the fiddle. And he was a fiddler. Between songs, he'd sit on the bar and tell stories. He became a very good storyteller. And little by little, he began to study more serious things. Eventually, he studied the law all on his own and became world famous in the English-speaking world with a case called the Parson's Cause. At the time, the Church of England at the time, tithed all property owners, so that you had to give 10% of the profits from your farm to the church. It was the law. It was the British law in England as well as over here. Well, in Patrick Henry's area, they were tobacco farmers. And when the crops were poor crops, they still had to give 10% of what they got. And that often left them with not enough to eat. And he challenged the king in court and won the case.
Mm.
And the farmers carried him out of the courtroom on their shoulders and around what was a very small town. And he became a hero everywhere. Again, he was a brilliant speaker. He loved to sing and play the fiddle at the same time. So he was very popular in many, many respects. And of course, in the farmlands of what was then the West, the sparsely settled farmlands, each farmer ran his own show. He didn't need any laws. He didn't steal from his neighbor. He had no desire to do so. And they'd get together with others at church once a week. And they all saw eye to eye in most things because they all had the same profession. They all spoke the same language, all did the same kind of work. And they didn't need government. So when this handsomely dressed fellow came into town and said he was a tax collector, they ran him out of town. And as did everyone in the States. George Washington put it very, very simply. He said, they don't have the right to put their hands in my pocket. And that was it. And every American felt the same way. So those were the seeds of the revolution. And
I mean, Patrick Henry had some definitive opinions about, I mean, the difference, I guess, between the federal government and the state government. And
that was a bit later on, because remember, they overthrew the federal government. The federal government was then the king and parliament.
Right.
And Patrick Henry sparked the revolution with his astonishing speech, which made headlines all over the Western world, that ended, "Give me liberty or give me death." Now, by then, the revolution had started a bit in Massachusetts. They had had the Tea Party, they'd had the Boston Massacre, British troops had come in and occupied Boston and sequestered the city, barricaded the city so that they were going to starve the people out until they surrendered. So Patrick Henry in his speech said to the listeners in Virginia, this was in Richmond, Virginia, in the church, why stand we here idle? Our brethren are already at war, meaning in Boston. And so Virginia, because each colony was an independent colony with an independent government, each colony declared independence. Massachusetts was first to declare independence. The fighting started up there, and then Virginia was next to declare independence. So they overthrew a federal government.
But it was kind of like they were the states, if you will, even though they're colonies. I mean, those areas ultimately kind of become the states later.
Each one became they were provinces under English rule, and originally they were colonies. They had no governments of their own. Then they became provinces under English rule. They were English provinces, and each one then declared independence one by one, and became self-governing units. They really weren't states. They were states in the global sense of France being a state, Italy being a state meaning almost a nation. Then came the Confederation, which tied them up loosely, the way the Swiss cantons are tied up, the way the provinces in Canada are tied up. Canada's a confederation, so is Switzerland. And the United States were a confederation for about 6 years. and the central government had no powers to tax and therefore couldn't raise an army. It was really threatened by Britain coming down from Canada. At sea, its ships were being attacked by other nations. So the federal government had almost no powers at all. And that's when the movement came. There was the first constitutional convention to try to write a constitution. And this is where both Patrick Henry and Thomas Paine come in, because they each had different views, as did everybody at the convention. There were those who wanted a strong central government. Benjamin Franklin wanted a weak king, equivalent to a king. And everybody knew that the eventual ruler of this new nation would be George Washington. He remained the great man, the father of his country, even after the Revolution. So
well, I think a lot of people don't realize it. Didn't we have a different first president under the Articles of Confederation?
No, he was, well, yes and no. He was president of Congress. He was not president of the Confederation. And so, in effect, John Hancock was the first president of the United States, but he was president of Congress, which means he presided over Congress, but did not rule the country. He had a title, but that's it. So really, there was no ruler. The central government was very, very weak. The only powers, and that's in quotes, that the Confederation Congress had was to negotiate with foreign governments. And it could rally the states. It had the right to call upon the states to form a continental army, much as they did in the Revolution. But it had no powers over that army. Indeed, Washington had had far fewer powers during the actual American Revolution. He had powers over a continental army that was formed by the state armies from Connecticut, New York, and a few of the northern states that permitted that to happen. But the other states had their own armies that fought, sometimes side by side with the Continental Army at Yorktown, for example, but often not at all, because there were different military campaigns going on, one in South Carolina, one in Virginia, a little bit in Georgia, a lot in North Carolina. But these were all separate campaigns. The only really huge joint campaign of the armies of the American provinces was at Yorktown, where they united with the French army as well to defeat Cornwallis and effectively end the war. So the first president was really George Washington, and that was after the writing of the Constitution. And the Constitutional Convention, which was held in Philadelphia, it did not actually ratify it. It approved the Constitution, and that document was then sent to each of the states' governments to ratify. And it was at the Ratification Congress in Virginia where Patrick Henry defined what every farmer in America and many, many craftsmen, a huge proportion of the American people believed was the correct form of government. And what he had, as I said, he was self-educated, and he had studied a book that is about this thick. It's at least 3 inches thick, and it's the Bible of political science. It was written by Montesquieu, the French political scientist. It's called The Spirit of the Laws. And in it, Montesquieu says that it's virtually impossible for a large heterogeneous population in a large geographic area to have a Republican form of government. There are simply too many conflicting interests. And as in Europe, there are too many conflicting languages. It's very difficult for them to understand each other and agree on things because they don't speak the same languages. Patrick Henry believed that firmly. Indeed, he believed the less government, the better off you are. Some of the things he said, he predicted that the Constitution would create a great and mighty president with the powers of a king, and it would give Congress the power of unlimited direct taxation. Anybody pay their income taxes recently? The American government would have powers to send troops into any state. He said it would absolutely be a big mistake. What he saw.
So Patrick Henry was not in favor of the Constitution.
Oh, he voted against it, and then refused to serve in Congress. He would have been elected, very popular in Virginia. He had been governor of Virginia 3 times, so he was very popular in Virginia and in most of the South. But when the Constitution, Virginia barely ratified, they voted against Patrick Henry, and Virginia as a state did ratify the Constitution. Patrick Henry voted against it, and his followers, who were legion, began rioting and cocking their rifles and shouting, we must fight, over and over again. And he had to calm them down. And unlike some political leaders today, notably on January 6th, Henry acted to calm the situation and prevent civil disobedience. Only then did he vow to continue a struggle for what became our Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution. And again, unlike today's political leaders, Patrick Henry told his followers in a brilliant speech, if I shall be in the minority, I will be a peaceable citizen. My head, my hand, my heart shall be at liberty to remove defects of the system in a constitutional way. I wish not to go to violence. What a distinct difference. And he was a patriot who had fought in the revolution, who had ignited the revolution, fought in it, and fought for American independence. And when it was passed, it was the will of the majority of the people. And he said, I will not go to violence. So it was brilliant. And he calmed the whole anti-constitutional movement, which didn't come up again until the issue of slavery became a great issue.
Well, I wish that's such an important story to tell. I mean, his story, as you say, he was a patriot and founding father. And I believe history repeats itself and we learn from history. So I'm happy you're telling us this because I think it's important to draw the analogies to today. As you said, I think it's a great example that whether or not you were on board with political development or not, I think you have to learn, as you say, whatever is the will of the majority of the people, that's how things are done. And, peaceful protesting is.
The problem now is exactly what Montesquieu and Patrick Henry predicted, that this is no longer a nation of farmers. And at the time of Patrick Henry, the 13 states, the majority of the nation lived on farms and plantations. A small percentage lived in the cities, and they were largely either skilled craftsmen, like Paul Revere was a coppersmith, or they were what were called merchant bankers. And these were at the ordinary level, they had a store, and a farmer would come in. There was no currency in the country at that time. There was no currency, so everything was on a barter basis. The farmer would come in and buy seeds, and so he would owe the merchant now for those seeds, which he'd pay at the end of the season at harvest time from whatever he received from his crop.
Oh, that's interesting.
And the merchant would then use that to buy things from England and have it brought over here. George Washington, who had a huge 20,000 acre plantation, was one of the richest, if not the richest man in the country. He and Martha bought dress materials, furniture, silverware, china for the table, books from their merchant in England, and they would pay for it in tobacco. So the tobacco, he'd ship the tobacco over to his merchant in Britain, who would buy it for a certain sum, which then became what was called a ledger credit. And then Washington could draw from that ledger credit to get the things that, excuse me, that he needed for his household. So that's the way the market, that's the way the country was, and it was a pretty homogeneous country. Most people couldn't read or write. Maybe 10% were literate. Most people worked on farms. They all had common interests, which were relatively limited. Today, you have a population that is so heterogeneous with so many different interests. There's no way you can equate the interests of the rancher near the Rocky Mountains with the broker on Wall Street or the shoemaker in Philadelphia.
Right.
Each has different interests, and he not only he can't envision the interests of alien cultures in this country. He doesn't care. He goes tisk when there's a big snowfall or a flood or a fire in California, but he doesn't really care. He's got his own troubles. He's got his own troubles. His wife got mugged on the street, or somebody stole his car, and those are different problems that he wants solved, and he wants the government to do it, because that's what politicians have promised the people: we will solve your problems. And not only don't they can't. It's impossible. These problems are insoluble in a huge heterogeneous population where so many people don't speak the same language. So many people live in different worlds. There are different worlds from block to block in New York City or Philadelphia or any major city. And their interests are not the same as the fruit grower in Georgia.
True. I mean, but that's true of anything, right? It's hard. Sometimes it's very hard to have the empathy maybe that we should have, because we tend to relate more to our own experiences and those who are having similar experiences.
Well, here's what Henry claimed spoke at the Constitutional Convention. He said that free men had a natural right to live free of the tyranny of rulers, American as well as British. And he cited philosopher Montesquieu, saying that individual rights were more secure in small republics where governors live among the governed than in large republics where the public good is sacrificed to 1,000 views. So he argued for, rather than big government created by the Constitution, he sought to create what he called an amicable alliance of independent sovereign states in America, similar to Switzerland. And he said the Swiss Confederation had stood upwards of 400 years, and now it's 600 years, braved all the power of ambitious monarchs and retained their independence, republican simplicity, and valor. And it's interesting that Switzerland, of course, is divided into 4 large language groups. One area only speaks Italian, another only speaks Schweizerdeutsch or German, another speaks French, and another speaks a jargon of its own that no one else in Europe speaks. But they're separated by mountains, even though they're the same country. And each area kind of governs itself, but each area has its own interests that are, which are common within that section.
Sounds very sane.
Well, it is if that's the makeup of the country in which you live, but that's not the makeup of the United States. And it's not the makeup of states within the United States. Northern New York State, which is religiously Republican, has very little in common with the New York metropolitan area of southeastern New York State, which is almost universally Democratic. And the mayor of New York is always in loggerheads with the governor, because the governor works in Albany, which is upstate, and is subject to the will of the people there, while the mayor has to live in New York City and is subject to the will of the people in New York City. And governing an urban area is not the same as governing a rural area. It can't be. It can't be. So it's why now, probably more, I think more than any time since the Civil War, we are so divided and so threatened, I think, in terms of our form of government. And the state governments themselves are falling apart in a sense. They're having difficulty governing their own, the people in their own states, and they're denying each state and many areas within the state is doing its best in this political fight to deprive members of the other political party or those who vote for the other party of their rights. Everybody's paying attention right now to these southern states like Texas, I mean, that are gerrymandering their districts, and deprive Nashville, Tennessee, gerrymandered the city to essentially strip the black vote of any power. They divided the district that was all black and used to elect its own Democratic congressman. They divided it into 3 parts and attached each part to a Republican district, so that all the black people in that old district have lost essentially they've lost their vote now. They won't be able to elect the person they want. But the same thing happened here in New York City. The Democrats created a new district as a lot of the wealthy people moved over to the Hudson River, where there was a strip of slums up and down the Hudson River. They not only raised many of the slums, they redistricted that whole area so that it remains Democratic, even though there are more Republicans than Democrats in the area. So everybody's guilty of this. They always have been. Gerrymandering was named after Elbridge Gerry, who was a political leader, a signer of the Constitution, a political leader in Massachusetts, and couldn't get elected to the federal government. But he was a governor of Massachusetts and had control of the Massachusetts legislature, and gerrymandered the state and created a new district that had a large enough population that he knew would vote for him. And the district was a big circular district, and the newspaper ran a cartoon of that and gave it the head of a salamander. And that's where, and his name was Jerry, and they said this was gerrymandered, and that's how the word was made up. So gerrymandering began in 1812, and Jerry won the vice presidency. In those days, the vice president ran separately from the president. And so by gerrymandering the states, voting district, he was able to win election to the vice presidency. He only lasted for 4 years.
Now,
Thank you.
in terms of Thomas Paine, how would you connect him, you think, to today's politics?
Well, he, of course, was in the United States for a long time. He arrived in 1775, just before the revolution began, was party to the revolution and fought in it, actually. He was this phenomenal writer, propagandist, in effect. And when the American army seemed defeated on the banks of the Delaware River, they were all camped out along the banks, and Washington knew he had to do something. And Thomas Paine wrote this startling, moving essay, which began, "These are the times that try men's souls." And he builds up to the necessity of fighting, that you can't just lose your soul to the devil. And it was so moving. Washington, in effect, ordered him to gallop down to Philadelphia and have it printed up. And he came back the next day, and Washington had all of his, handed out this essay to all of the officers to read to their men. And it so inspired the men that they got on boats at Washington's orders, crossed the Delaware, which was full of ice and very dangerous crossing in a snowstorm on Christmas night. And he had laid out a plan to attack Trenton, which was occupied by Hessian troops. And they were all celebrating on Christmas night because the Americans were defeated, as far as they knew. And they were still drunk at dawn when the Americans landed and overran them and defeated them. And it was an important defeat, but the real importance was psychologically. Across America, though everyone was discouraged by the defeat of Washington's army in New York, and now they had hope. The army had defeated not just the British, but the Hessians, who were mercenaries. They did nothing for a living except fight wars. So they were the most brilliant troops, and we slaughtered them. We caught them by surprise, and it lifted American morale. Everybody thought that we could now win this war. And Washington intuited a strategy from the Battle of Trenton. He had been absolutely crushed in New York and retreated up to Westchester, was crushed at White Plains in another battle, retreated across to Jersey, and the British army was following him. They were running. His troops were deserting. They didn't have enough to eat. It was a terribly cold early winter, and it was raining most of the time. Troops didn't have enough clothing. They didn't have enough to eat. Finally, they get across. They save the remnants of the army, crosses the Delaware, and Washington had enough foresight to order his troops to go up and down the banks on the one side of the river and get any kind of rowboats that are there and bring them across, so that the Hessians couldn't cross over and follow them. So they found safe haven on the Pennsylvania side of the river, but it was cold, it was nasty, it was horrible. And morale was at its low ebb. And the Battle of Trenton, which was inspired, the victory at Trenton, inspired by Thomas Paine's "These are the times to try men's souls," lifted spirits across the country. It was just a remarkable event.
Who would have thunk that words on paper could move a nation? Amazing.
Well, he was brilliant, and he wrote in, language in those days, written language, printed language was very, very flowery. Not quite as much as Elizabethan English, but it was very, very flowery language. He wrote in simple language that everyone could understand.
Yeah.
And most people couldn't read. So the printers would put, when they printed a newspaper or something like Thomas Paine's essay, they'd post it in the window of their print shop.
Mm.
The crowd would gather and wait for some literate person to read the words aloud to the illiterate. Only about 10% of the people could read. So the Paine's words were remarkable in the swiftness with which they spread, because people could actually memorize them. These are the times that try men's souls. Every word is a one-syllable word. Very easy to remember. But then with the Constitutional Convention, Paine, like Patrick Henry, saw the dangers of the Constitution. Patrick Henry had said, my great objection to this document is that it does not leave us the means of defending our rights or of waging war against tyrants. He said, the sword and the purse, the two greatest powers of government, the junction of these without limitation in the same hands is despotism. So he said, if Congress or a state government in the execution of their powers shall do wrong, how will you come to them to punish them if they are at a distance of 500 miles? You're in the southern Illinois. How are you going to punish the people who are up in the middle of the state of Springfield? Well, the governor of Virginia, who was then at the convention, he answered Patrick Henry by saying, well, the people will rise up against them. And Patrick Henry waited for him and stood and said, oh, sir, when have you ever seen people rise up and overthrow a king? And the convention burst into laughter, of course, but they still voted for the Constitution. And like Henry, Paine was very dubious about the Constitution, and he wrote a really moving piece, which is very sad, in effect. He says, when we contemplate the fall of empire and the extinction of the nations of the ancient world, we see but little to excite our regret than the moldering ruins of pompous palaces, magnificent monuments, lofty pyramids, and walls and towers of the most costly workmanship. But when the empire of America shall fall, the subject for contemplative sorrow will be infinitely greater than crumbling brass and marble can inspire. It will not be said, here stood a temple of vast antiquity, here rose a Babel of invisible height, or there a palace of sumptuous extravagance. But here, painful thought, here the noblest work of human wisdom, the grandest scheme of human endeavor has fallen.
Wow.
Beautiful. And if you're not as a communicator, if you're not communicating with the least common denominator, you're not communicating, really.
Exactly. And the problem is there is no common denominator anymore. I mean, just the interests of the immigrants, for example. That's not the interest of the people who have jobs 50 miles from the border. There is no common denominator, and that's what Montesquieu and Patrick Henry feared would cause the demise of the American empire, that there no longer are common interests. The interests of the people who lost their homes to fire in California are not the same as the interests of fishermen in Maine.
But hasn't that always been true?
Not to this extent, not to this extent. You never had Well, first of all, you didn't have global warming. Secondly, you didn't have this extent of the forest fires, but it never was true for this large a population. If one person lost a home to fire in a small town, well, the other neighbors would get together and have a home building party, and they'd all help him rebuild his home. Or if the church burned down, have a church building party. You don't have that in when there's a large population involved, because they don't know each other. And the probability is, in a large population like that, they've been competing against each other in their daily lives. It's hard for them to come together. You don't have the small town village life that was based less on personalities than on common interests. The farmer in a small town, the small town farmer, well, he had common interests with the merchant in the town. He had common interests with the wagon maker, with the forge who forged his plows and farm instruments. There were common interests that brought them together. And whether they liked each other personally or not made no difference. They had common interests. And usually they had a common church. Again, forged their community.
So
this no longer is the case. 2/3 of Americans don't belong to any religious organization. And the rest probably are in churches that are in conflict with other churches. I mean, the entire Protestant community is at war with itself. You know, the Baptists don't get along with the Episcopals, so they don't get along with the Seventh-day Adventists, who don't get along with the Christians. All you had was the Church of England. and after independence, you had became the American Episcopal Church, with the Archbishop of Canterbury still the head of the church.
But at the end of the day, I mean, what we all share, I think, in common is a desire to be able to individually make choices for what religion we would want to belong to, or what's best for our families. Don't we all like love our kids and want to make the best life we can, want to make ends meet? I mean, doesn't that commonality and the freedom to make our choices, doesn't that commonality bind us together?
No, because we don't all feel that same way. For many, many people, children are an accident. You have 100,000 unwanted children in this country right now in foster care or in group homes that nobody wants, and nobody cares about. You have not only unwanted children, you have a huge rate of divorce in this country. The social fabric of the country is deteriorating along with the political fabric. And the commonality you're talking about is only true in smaller communities. And the United States is just too huge a community for us to come together. And we can see that, I mean, even in Congress, where you think they would all have the same interests, they can't agree on anything. The Senate is deadlocked half and half, and no matter how long they sit together negotiating, they can't come together.
Well,
how do you expect unskilled people, politicians? I mean, the word politician implies someone who can get along with other people. And if they can't get along, how do you expect ordinary people on the street, when a car swerves in front of you, not to get angry?
Yeah.
And without gun control, they take the guns out and they shoot each other.
Well, you seem to be indicating that Thomas Paine, in a somewhat, prolific way, foresaw today's politics, today's demise, which is a little bit discouraging, I have to say.
It's terribly discouraging, but now you can understand what the people in Pompeii felt
Mm.
So
when the
would,
lava was coming off of Vesuvius.
would you agree or have any opinion on the idea that I've been playing with lately and for a long time in my life, actually, that the problem actually lies in the brain of every person, and that the number one offender is resentment?
Yes, that's partially true. It's resentment and it's frustration. Look at the commercials you see on television of a lovely, clean, healthy family in this beautiful, bright home with every appliance in the kitchen and beautiful furniture in the living room. How do you think that makes someone in the slums with no skills, no trades, no formal education, can't get a job? How do you think that makes them feel?
Resentful.
More than resentful, discouraged, despondent, no sense of hope. And this sense of hopelessness in a large proportion of our population is something that the government no longer really cares about, and is certainly not doing anything. And what would have to be done would be so monumental that no one's even talking about it. The first thing you'd have to do is just tear down every public school in the country and rebuild the whole public schools education system. And right now, many people in many towns are tearing it down. Parents are taking over school boards and locking educators out and telling educators what they have to teach. Ignorant people are now running public schools in America. That's not a formula for success. No, this is the American civilization is in a state of decline. There's no question about it. When I hate to sound like every old man, but years ago, when television first came out, you had the equivalent of Broadway musicals on television. You had lots of comedies. Now all you have are murder shows and audience participatory events involving strength and survival in the jungle. What is so good about surviving in the jungle? We don't live in a jungle. We live in apartment buildings, and we're having trouble living happily in the apartment buildings. There should be a show showing how people survive living in an apartment building.
Brilliant idea.
Not in a jungle or a desert island. It's ridiculous. Our focus is on the wrong thing right now, culturally, educationally.
So bring back the comedies.
Oh, absolutely. On a personal note, I watch almost every night. I watch YouTube old comedy shows from the 50s and 60s and musicals. And I go to bed with a smile on my face.
Wow. But both Henry David Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson both agreed that the number one measure of success in life is to laugh often.
Absolutely, and to care about others. It's very important to care, and we just don't seem to. We care when it's easy to care. One person dies in a particularly ugly way, and their flowers build up on the sidewalk. No one knew the person. It's just a good story. And other people are dying all the time in uglier ways. And kids are dying, in a sense, in awful public schools where they don't learn how to, many don't learn how to read or write, much less how to conduct themselves in life.
Well, what would your opinion be on the idea that people everyone basically thinks they're doing the right thing, They think they're doing the right thing, driven by a brain that thinks it's doing the right thing. And
And worse than that, it knows it's doing the right thing.
yeah,
That's the worst thing. It doesn't
that's the
think.
problem.
Because if it were thinking, it could be convinced, but it knows it's doing.
Yeah,
The people who are not getting vaccinated know that they should not get vaccinated. And they've never studied anything, and this is the danger of inadequate education. They've never studied anything, and yet they publicly speak out as if they had studied virology, histology, bacteriology, epidemiology, all of the sciences, as if they knew something about medicine, and they know nothing, but they know it all.
and the brain is at the whim of the latest this or that. Meanwhile, the brain cannot be managed. It just hears what it hears and does what it does.
Yeah.
Is that, you agree?
It won't be managed. It refuses to be managed because it's convinced it's right.
Right. Yeah.
It has no consideration of the effects on others.
No compassion. No sense. Yeah.
The golden rule, most people don't even know it anymore, much less follow it. They do unto themselves,
Yeah.
as they would have others do unto them.
Yeah.
So it's a reverse of the golden rule.
I also think, though, that you guys are being no disrespect, but I think you're also being very negative by couching it in such a defined way, right? Because
we're not couching it in any. We're exposing it. The opposite of couching.
Well, I mean, isn't the reality, though, that the brain, no matter what you think, is more controlled by the heart? Your brain can be telling you to do something that knows something right, but your heart just won't let you. Emotion does balance in what
right, but the heart of Andrew Carnegie, who made millions developing steel in the steel industry in this country. When he saw he had $10 million in the bank, he said that's enough, and he went out and built 3,500 public libraries across the United States so that others could study. He had come over as a poor boy from Scotland, had educated himself in a library, and now he tried to set the stage for others to follow suit, as opposed to, I got his first name, Zuckerberg, who founds, a brilliant mind, founds Facebook.
Oh, Mark Zuckerberg.
Mark Zuckerberg founds Facebook and builds a flourishing empire with his intelligence, and then lets it be taken over by people who do nothing but present misinformation. He lets it be taken over by racists, by fascists, by all of the evil people. Sure, there are loads of good people, but the good people material doesn't get read as easily as the evil people. Because the evil people is more sensational, and unfortunately, kids read it too, and believe what they say, and that's unconscionable. For what's his name, Bezos, to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars to send a couple of actors up to the edge of space and have a good time for 4 hours, when that money could have built 100 or more public schools, could have raised the salaries of public school teachers, could have benefited the world. And there was once a generation of very successful, prominent people who who used their money to set up beneficial methods of helping the world. The Rockefeller Foundation is still in existence. So is the Ford Foundation. And of course, Carnegie Not only this foundation, he founded a university. He founded, as I say, 3,500 public libraries across the country in small towns. The big cities had their public libraries. That's where he studied at the Pittsburgh Library. So there was an age. I'm not saying they weren't called robber barons because they were all did everything so good for mankind, but they did leave legacies of great benefits to their communities and to their societies. That's not true anymore. These people, what is Gates doing for society? What is Bezos doing for society? They're just accumulating more wealth. What is Zuckerberg doing for society? He's not giving. He could be giving computers to every school, every classroom of every school in the country. He could be doing
the moral consciousness, you'd say, of the moral fabric.
There is none. It's gone. It's disappeared. Why? I have no idea. Perhaps it's just sheer wealth that spoils people.
If we can't manage our brains, and the brain is just at the whim of whatever it hears or sees or feels, then I need some way to manage my brain.
Well, management of the brain begins when you come out of the womb. And if the parents don't take care of their children and educate their children, and then see to it when the education becomes more and more academic, that they get the best academicians to educate them at that level, you're not going to have much of a functioning brain. Certainly not a brain that's going to function properly in a democratic society. You know, democratic society is always the long term. The real term is Republican society. Democracy is rule of the majority, period. And that's why the Greeks failed, because they had a democracy. Rome had a republic, but then it got too ambitious, got too rich, got too ambitious, and spread out too far. But so really what we have in America is a republican with a lowercase r, Republican form of government, which is no longer functioning properly.
So advice, lead us back to something positive. If we can dip back into history, does anybody, you think, write or have some advice to help?
No, we've had good and very interesting periods in our history. The first really remarkable period was under James Monroe, called the Era of Good Feeling, in which, thanks to the Louisiana Purchase, we added 6 states, and he opened them up to settlers, and you could go and stake your claim to a certain amount of land if you build a house on it. So it enriched hundreds of thousands of Americans. They became property owners, they became farmers, some had trades, and he built a network of roads and canals and railroads to tie the northern states. The southern states refused, but to tie the northern states together so that there was commerce between all the states. And you know, a lot of young men and women were reluctant to leave home, because to go out west, you probably never see your parents again, or your family, or your friends. With the construction of roads and railways under Monroe, people could now travel. And they didn't hesitate to go out west, because they knew they could come back and visit whenever they wanted to, and their friends in the East could visit them. And of course, they conduct commerce at the same time and grow rich. So that was a spectacular period of 8 years that lasted, into the John Quincy Adams administration, but then came to an end under Andrew Jackson, who sowed divisions between the American people in a really vicious way. And of course, that was the beginning of the decline into the Civil War period, where now we had a whole new set of problems that to deal with that just took away from the rest of the economy, the rest of the nation. I don't think we've ever really truly recovered from it. There was another period after the Second World War under Eisenhower where he not only was a man of conscience, he borrowed a trick from James Monroe, and he had to bamboozle the Congress into building the interstate highway system to connect the nation, to connect it commercially, socially, every which way. But they were not going to pass it. It was a boondoggle as far as they were concerned. And being the former general and commander-in-chief, he told them, no, this isn't to make anybody, this is for national defense. Suppose we get attacked in the Pacific, like the Japanese attacked us in Pearl Harbor. Suppose we get, how are our tanks in the East going to get there? We need an interstate. And so he presented it as strictly for defense.
Can I say,
and of course, it was the greatest commercial enterprise the government had ever taken. Today's Republicans would call it socialism, but but it was brilliant. Eisenhower was a brilliant general.
You are. I'm always captivated talking to you, listening to you. Has knowledge availed you happiness? Has self-knowledge availed you happiness?
Has self-knowledge? Well, I'm not
or
sure.
Just knowledge.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure how you define happiness. A lot of words are thrown around; they have no meaning. You know.
Okay.
A beautiful day. What's beautiful mean? Beautiful doesn't mean anything. What it mean? It's adjectives generally have no meaning, and most adverbs don't have any meaning.
Let's change it to
verbs and nouns have meaning.
Let's change it to has knowledge availed you a feeling of goodness? Good.
I don't know what goodness means.
Okay.
What's good for you may be bad for me, and vice versa. Knowledge has simply
given you power,
well,
right? Doesn't knowledge give you a certain power to change?
It can, but if you're going to sit in a laboratory all your life and just keep experimenting, it's going to give you power. It gives you the ability to function productively as a human being. That's the primary benefit. And that's why so many people without adequate education grow up incapable of surviving at a bare minimum level in a developed country. In an undeveloped country, it doesn't make that much difference because nobody is formally educated, or very few people are formally educated, and they get along fine because they farm and live a very primitive life. In a primitive society, you only need the education to function in the society in which you live.
Mm-hmm.
In a society, in an advanced society, industrial society like the United States, you need far more education than the public schools provide.
So
you need more education than the universities provide. The universities, especially the public universities, are a laughingstock. David McCullough, the historian, sponsored a survey of college seniors from the 100 top rated colleges and universities in America, rated by U.S. News and World Report, and 67% didn't know who the commanding officer at Yorktown, at the Battle of Yorktown, was. Most of them listed General Grant. who was in the Civil War. They, and as Dave put it, if you don't know Yorktown, you don't know American history. If you don't know American history, how can you function productively and happily in American society? The answer is you can't. You think you can. You can fool yourself into thinking you're productive, and because you're getting $120,000 a year to add and subtract numbers or to gamble. But it's not a productive life.
So reach back into history. I'm sorry, Seamus, go ahead.
What would you say is their productive lives, Harlow?
Well, I'd say many great political leaders have led productive lives. I think you can name them as well as I. I think that a productive life, certainly in many people in the arts lead productive lives, many people in industry lead productive lives.
You seem to be
self-employed tradesmen can lead enormously productive life. I had a close friend for many years who was a carpenter, cabinet maker, and he worked for himself, and he transformed people's homes into little paradises. He worked wonders with woodwork, cabinet making, building, and that's productive life. Many artists lead productive lives. They bring beauty and joy to people. But certainly tradesmen and tradesmen now are disappearing, which is a tragedy. All these public universities have put out this propaganda. You got to go to college to earn a living, and that's just not true. Most college graduates earn far less than electricians and plumbers and carpenters and tradespeople, whom we need desperately. And one of the things in this country that I think has been terrible. I lived in Europe for many years, and in Europe, tradesmen are respected. In this country, we demean tradesmen. A professor would never invite a carpenter to his house for dinner, and yet the professor could learn a lot from a carpenter. And we demean the trades as if they're beneath anyone with a college degree. And most people with college degrees learn nothing at college, and they waste. It's a waste of money, and now they're going deeply into debt. The student debt is a scandal in this country. And why are they going into debt? At University of Alabama, the football coach makes $12 million a year. A classroom instructor makes $45,000 a year, and the kids have to pay $25,000 to $30,000 a year and wind up in debt the rest of their lives. It's become a scandal, and for what? It's for entertainment, to watch these teams play football. And every weekend, 100,000 of the people are out in the stadium cheering for this. These grown men playing a children's game and beating themselves up. Meanwhile, they're learning nothing in the classroom.
So creativity, if I'm hearing you, the thing that almost every thing on the list, every career on the list, or every item on the list in terms of productivity have in common is that there's some level of creativity. Whether you're creating a piece of beautiful art for the world, somehow you're using creativity to make a difference, right? To bring joy into the world or leave it a little bit better. The creativity, that's what I'm hearing, binds together in terms of productivity for you. Is that safe to say?
I agree with that.
Now, is there any kernel of advice that history or a particular person in our American history could offer us now to help things get better? I think you addressed throughout this interview, there's a lot of turmoil, and there's concern in how we get past this. How do we fix what appears to be, very broken? And I believe that history often does repeat itself. So I'm confident with your knowledge of history that someone has offered advice or has a blueprint. Can you give us something positive to hold on to here?
Throughout history, as civilizations have deteriorated, there's no example of any that has recovered on the way down. There's a momentum, I think, that foretells the continuation of the deterioration. You have to start at a level where everything has stopped. With the end of the Second World War and the arrival of Eisenhower, everything had stopped, and we had to start again. We had to rebuild industry because we hadn't been bombed, but most of our industry had become obsolete during the war. In 1945, our factories were still 1940 factories, and they were backward. And now we were helping destroyed economies overseas rebuild. They were rebuilding with the most modern equipment. And it wasn't very long before Japanese car makers were selling more cars than the American car makers. And German instruments were outselling American instruments. So we had to start rebuilding. And it took a man with tremendous charisma and, of course, intelligence to get us back on track and to get it to start us growing again. That was Eisenhower, but there are very few men like that. No president has ever succeeded in doing what he succeeded. Monroe did, and to a certain extent he tried, but really in the end he laid the groundwork for later on, but he provided no real growth. It was Roosevelt. But Roosevelt introduced socially progressive ideas like Social Security that didn't stem the Depression, but were in place when we started growing again as a nation in the late 40s. But very few administrations have been able to stem the decline of the nation. Individual states have been able to do it because they have a smaller economy with which to deal. And for many decades, many states were self-sufficient and didn't really need foreign trade, for example, or trade with other states, or trade with other regions of the country. Many states were, had single industry economies. Many of the southern states were dependent on cotton and textiles. And they didn't, Alabama didn't get into the 20th century until the federal government built Huntsville space station there.
Is the answer to this question, though, that you don't see a path forward, or there?
I don't anymore. No, I think this the gradual decline of this society as we know it. I'm not sure what the climax to the decline will be. What it could be. Some people are saying civil war. I kind of doubt it. These phony militias aren't big enough or well armed enough or well trained enough to stage a civil war. The January 6th crowd, they're not going to stage a civil war. I think the political leaders might. You've got some of these extreme right-wing political leaders like DeSantis in Florida, Abbott in Texas, who I think at some point would be, if not they, their progeny, could well say, we'll go out on our own. We don't need the United States. And I think they would join with several other states. And of course, each of these governors has a National Guard. So they have a military, and they could stage 4 or 5 states contiguous to each other. It would probably be the southern states. They could stage a secession and probably win this time, because I don't think the North really cares anymore.
Wow. Well, that's kind of bleak. I don't think I don't agree.
You and I won't live to see it, but I'd say in the next 200 years. Well, you might live to see it. I apologize.
I don't. Go ahead, James.
You're still under 20, so you have plenty of time.
My brain.
So at the risk of being maybe mocked, laughed at, I don't know. I have to say, I'd be remiss not to say this, that 26 years ago, I was given a formula to solve all my problems. And the
let me guess, Clorox.
I tried that actually. I didn't not with Clorox. I tried some other way, but it didn't work. Thank God. Anyway, so someone showed me how to scientifically apply the 12 steps to my life. And I've done them I did them this morning, and I've done them every day for 26 years, and they solve all my problems.
Well, my son had the same problem, and he was a veteran, is a veteran, and the VA hospital had a whole branch in Brooklyn that does nothing but deal with that kind of problem, and he has been free of that problem now. It's 10 years last December 7th. So I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and
the problem that affects that affects far more than the individual. Of course, it affects the family.
Yeah,
it affects friends, and again, Bezos spends $4 billion to send a couple of actors up to the edge of space when he could be investing to help ordinary people solve a problem that is terrible. Problem, devastating.
And actually, in my case, no money required at all. I needed a pen and paper. That's what I needed.
Yeah.
And
my son, that didn't work for my son. It didn't work for my son. In fact, he hated it and was almost kicked out of one meeting where he was asked, "Do you want a drink?"
Yeah.
Something like that. Of course I do.
Yeah. I relate to that, but I'm not talking about meetings. I'm talking about the 12 steps, which have nothing to do with meetings.
Oh, in addition to, yeah.
Yeah, nothing to do with meetings. And someone showed me how to do them, and I do them personally. Yeah. I do them every single morning I wake up, and I've shown hundreds how to do them, and that works.
You tried that. The only thing that worked was the VA. Yeah, everybody has a different solution, and everybody's an individual, and what helps one person may or may not help the next person. As my son puts it, everybody's got to reach their own bottom, and with him it was in the VA hospital, and touch wood, we family has lived happily ever after, or not ever after, for 10 years at least.
Beautiful.
Which is a good time.
Yeah.
On that note, I think we're gonna close the podcast out because we're out of time. Harlow, you're always an interesting person. James and I really enjoy having you on. You're so knowledgeable.
Yes. Brilliant.
I enjoy being with you and having these discussions.
And thank you. We'll put the links up to Harlow's website. If you can pick up any one of his books, well worth the read. He's a renowned author and historian and journalist.
May I show you the Patrick Henry and
And the
Thomas
Paine book, absolutely show them. By the way, I've read them both. I'm not just speaking, this is something I'm not aware of, but yeah, I've read them both. They are very good. Yeah, it's a great read. I mean, I learned so much about Patrick Henry I didn't know. And
he's a terrific person. He really was.
And he's very topical today, I think, between state rights and federal rights. So
yeah. And then here
it takes one to know one.
Thomas Paine. And one thing we forgot to mention about Patrick Henry, George Washington called Patrick Henry the real father of our country.
Wow.
He sired 17 children, who in turn had 77 grandchildren. And genealogists estimate there are 100,000 Americans today who are direct descendants.
Wow.
Of Patrick Henry. So that's why George Washington called Patrick Henry the real father of our country.
Something to be known for.
He was a wonderful man. He really was. And he founded or helped found a university in Virginia so his sons could go to college. Randolph-Macon College in Lynchburg, Virginia, was founded in part by Patrick Henry. He was truly a great man.
I agree. And so we're going to thank Harlow for being here. Seamus and I are going to say goodbye from the podcast. And also, just to leave on a positive note, I'd like to say that I do believe, a little bit differently than what Harlow was talking about today, but I do believe that with passion and the desire to fix things, things can always be fixed. So I don't want to leave the podcast in a manner that of hopelessness. I do believe that we just have to take a real look at what the problems are and try our best to listen as well as we speak.
And can I just say, I don't believe it. I live it. It is my life.
Yeah. So
But
from
you're not
Seamus
in
and I, we
Congress.
say don't give up hope.
Harlow,
Neither of you are in the Senate.
No.
we're very fortunate.
But we both believe strongly in creativity. So we're on board with you. We try to make that the focus even of what we talk about a lot here, creativity and creating positive things in society in any form, creativity in any form.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. It's always fun to be on your show.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Come back again.
I certainly will.